The value of poetry makes the case for the vital importance of poetry in human culture, and especially as a cultural and aesthetic and political form in the contemporary world. Poetry is often seen as overly complicated, as esoteric, as elitist, but I try to show that poetry isn't simply willfully difficult or annoyingly rebarbative, but rather that it's complex because it's trying to understand and represent the inner intricacies of life and culture, both of which are exceedingly complex. A poem's job isn't to simplify experience or to glibly straighten out the kinks of existence and history. Rather, poems use that most basic and vital of human tools, language, in order to bring those complexities to the surface and into some sort of compelling form. I wanted to write about why poetry matters now and how it matters now. And so I tend in the book to focus on relatively recent poems. And so many of the readings in the book are by poets such as Claudia Rankine, Seamus Heaney, Layli Long Soldier, and Tracy Smith, and of course a number of others. When I was first invited to propose a book called The Value of Poetry, I was initially going to decline. I had other stuff that I wanted to kind of start working on, and I think, daunted by the idea of writing a book about value, which is such a vexed and naughty term. I didn't want to write a book called The Value, capital V, of Poetry, capital P, and so then suggest that poetry kind of writ large and universally was some sort of ennobling force in the world, which it isn't, or can make people better, which it can't, or had some inherent ethical value. And so I was going to kind of beg off, but I realized that if I could think about it rather than as the value of poetry, capital P, but the value of poems, lowercase p, poems, then I might be able to find a way in. And so I try to show in the book not why poetry matters or why poets matter, but why poems matter. What they offer to readers that's different than what novels offer, or movies, or Twitter, and why those formal features of poems that might too simply be kind of overlooked or disregarded, or simply enjoyed as ornaments, right? Rhymes, sound effects, various visual configurations on the page, why all of those things do significant and substantial meaning-making work. So, poems offer readers spaces of attention and spaces of play. They ask to be attended to and imagined through. And so, certainly, many poems say things about, quote, the pressing issues of the world. And my book examines a number of important recent poems that have something very vital to say about those most pressing issues: systemic racism, environmental catastrophe, historical injustices that are very, very much shaping our current world still. However, poems often proceed sidewise or obliquely, without a definite end or goal in mind. They're fully entangled in their materials, the density of words and their patternings, the wandering shapes of intellectual and emotional life, the ways in which individual lives are shaped by social and historical conditions, but not simply a function of them. And so poems often have a somewhat angled relation to the world from which they emerge. So maybe this is just a roundabout way of saying that I pretty much agree with Auden's compressed treatise on the value of poetry that is folded into his Elegy on Yeats. Poetry makes nothing happen, he famously writes. That's the most well-known bit. Perhaps the most important bit is the passage a few lines down, in which he says that poetry is, quote, a way of happening, a mouth. So I try to show in the book as best as I can poetry's particular ways of happening and why those ways are so valuable. I guess embedded in this question is that kind of unstated anxiety or worry that it won't or that it couldn't, that poetry is part of some past world or some residual practice. And I don't think that's true at all. I do think that poetry is a remarkable means for representing and thinking about the past and the relation of the past to the present. And I also think that good poems and poems that most and end up mattering most embed a kind of futurity into them that think about readers down the line. And this, of course, becomes increasingly vexed within a moment of global ecological crisis when the idea of the future itself seems to be in peril. And this is a topic that I look at in the final chapter of the book. But back to your question, of course poetry will survive in the 21st century digital world. It will, as it has done throughout the histories of cultures, change, transmute, transmogrify, but it will certainly survive, and I think it will actually thrive. If a poem is a way of pressurizing, of making strange, of making dense the language that we use in order to try and catch and understand something of what it is like to be in the world, then considering the conditions of the 20th century world that we're in, all of the tumult and crisis of the present, then poets are certainly needed. They're not needed, say, more than ever, because I don't know if that's quite true, but they're needed just as they always have been.